That night, as Stanley lay on his scratchy, smelly cot, he tried to figure out what he could have done differently. But there was nothing he could do. For once in his unlucky life, he was in the right place at the right time, and it didn't help him. "You got it?" he asked X-Ray the next morning at breakfast. X-Ray looked at him with half-opened eyes behind his dirty glasses. "I don't know what you're talking about," he grumbled. "You know," said Stanley. "No, I don't," X-Ray snapped. "Just leave me alone, okay? I don't want to talk to ya." Stanley didn't say another word. Mr. Sir marched the boys out to the lake, chewing sunflower seeds along the way, and spitting out the shells. He scraped the ground with his boot heel to mark where each boy was supposed to dig. Stanley stamped down on the back of the blade of the shovel, piercing the hard, dry earth. He couldn't figure out why X-Ray snapped at him. If he wasn't going to produce the tube, why did he make Stanley give it to him? Was he just going to keep it? The tube was gold in color, but Stanley didn't think it was real gold. The water truck came a little after sunrise. Stanley finished his last drop of water and stepped up out of his hole. At this time of day, Stanley sometimes could see the distant hills or mountains on the other side of the lake. They were only visible for a short while and then would soon disappear behind the haze of heat and dirt. The truck stopped, and the dust cloud drifted past it. X-Ray took his place at the front of the line. Mr. Podensky filled his canteen. "Thanks, Mom," X-Ray said. He didn't mention the tube. Mr. Podensky filled all the canteens, then climbed back into the cab of the pickup. He still had to bring water to Group E. Stanley could see them digging about around 200 yards away. "Mr. Podensky!" Mr. X-Ray shouted from his hole. "Wait, Mr. Podensky, I think I might have found something." All the boys followed Mr. Podensky as he walked over to X-Ray's hole. Stanley could see the gold tube sticking out of some dirt at the end of X-Ray's shovel. Mr. Podensky examined it and took a long look at its flat bottom. "I think the warden's going to like this." "Does X-Ray get the day off?" asked Squid. "Just keep digging until someone says otherwise," Mr. Podensky said. Then he smiled. "But if I were you, Rex, I wouldn't dig too hard." Stanley watched the cloud of dust move across the lake to the cabin beneath the trees. The boys in Group E were just going to have to wait. It didn't take long for the pickup to return. Mr. Podensky stepped out of the cab. A tall woman with red hair stepped out of the passenger's side. She looked even taller than she was since Stanley was down at his hole. She wore a black cowboy hat and black cowboy boots, which were studded with turquoise stones. Her sleeves on her shirt were rolled up, and her arms were covered with freckles, as was her face. She walked right up to X-Ray. "This is where you found it, I suppose?" "Yes, ma'am." "Your good work will be rewarded," she said to Mr. Podensky. "Drive X-Ray back to camp. Let him take a double shower and give him some clean clothes. But first, I want you to fill everyone's canteens." "I just filled them a little while ago," said Mr. Podensky. The warden stared hard at him. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was soft. "I had just filled them when Rex—" "Excuse me," the warden said again. "Did I ask you when you last filled them?" No, but it's just... Excuse me? Mr. Podensky stopped talking. The warden wriggled her little finger for him to come to her. It's hot, and it's only going to get hotter, she said. Now, these fine boys have been working hard. Don't you think it might be possible that they might have taken a drink since you last filled their canteens? Mr. Podensky said nothing. The warden turned to Stanley. Caveman, will you come here, please? Stanley was surprised she knew him by name. He had never seen her until she stepped out of the truck, and he didn't even know the warden was a woman. He nervously went towards her. Mr. Podensky and I have been having a discussion. Have you taken a drink since Mr. Podensky last filled your canteen? Stanley didn't want to cause any trouble for Mr. Podensky. I still got plenty left, he said. Excuse me? He stopped. Yeah, I drank some. Thank you. May I see your canteen, please? Stanley handed it to her. Her fingernails were painted dark red. She gently shook the canteen, letting the water swish around in the plastic container. Do you hear the empty spaces? She asked. Yes, said Mr. Podensky. Then fill it, she said. And the next time I tell you to do something, I expect you to do it without questioning my authority. If it's too much trouble for you to fill a canteen, I'll give you the shovel. You can dig the hole, and the caveman can fill your canteen. She turned back to Stanley. I don't think that would be too much of a problem for you, would it? No, said Stanley. So what will it be? She asked Mr. Podensky. Do you want to fill the canteens, or do you want to dig? I'll fill the canteens, said Mr. Podensky. Thank you. Mr. Podensky filled their canteens. The warden got a pitchfork out of the back of the pickup. She poked it through X-Ray's dirt pile to see if anything else might have been buried in there as well. After you drop off X-Ray, I would like you to bring back 3 wheelbarrows, she said. X-Ray got in the pickup. As the truck pulled away, he leaned out the wide window and waved. 0, said the warden. I want you to take over X-Ray's hole. She seemed to know that 0 was the fastest digger. Armpit and Squid, you will keep digging where you have been, but you're each going to have a helper. Zigzag, you help Armpit. Magnet will help Squid. And Caveman, you'll work with 0. You're going to dig the dirt twice. 0 will dig it out of their hole, and Caveman will carefully shovel it into the wheelbarrow. Zigzag will do the same for Armpit, and the same with Magnet and Squid. We don't want to miss anything. If either of you find something, you'll both get the rest of the day off and double showers. When the wheelbarrows are full, you are to dump them away from this area. You don't want any dirt piles to get in the way. The warden remained at the site for the remainder of the day, along with Mr. Potensky and Mr. Sir, who showed up after a while. Occasionally, Mr. Sir would leave to take water to the other groups of campers, but otherwise, he and the water truck stayed parked there. The warden saw to it that nobody in Group D was ever thirsty. Stanley did as he was told. He carefully looked through all the dirt dug up by Zero as he shoveled it into the wheelbarrow. Although he knew he wouldn't find anything, it was easier than digging his own hole. When the wheelbarrow was full, he took it a good distance away before dumping it. The warden couldn't keep still. She kept walking around, looking over the boys' shoulders and sticking her pitchfork through the dirt piles. "You're doing fine, just fine," she told Stanley. After a while, she told the boys to switch, so that Stanley, Zigzag, Magnet dug in the holes, and Zero, Armpit, Squid shoveled the excavated dirt into the wheelbarrows. After lunch, Zero took over the digging again, and Stanley returned to the wheelbarrow. "There's no hurry," the warden said several times. "The main thing is not to miss anything." The boys dug until each hole was well over 6 feet deep and wide. Still, it was easier for 2 boys to dig a 6-foot hole than it was for 1 boy to dig a 5-foot hole. "All right, that's enough for today," the warden said. "I've waited this long. I can wait another day." Mr. Sir drove her back to the cabin. "I wonder how she knew all of our names," Stanley said as he walked back to the compound. "She watches all the time," said Zigzag. "She's got hidden microphones and cameras all over the place, in the tents, the rec room, the shower." "The shower?" said Stanley. He wondered if Zigzag was just being paranoid. "The cameras are tiny," said Armpit. "They're no bigger than the toenail on your little toe." Stanley had doubts about that. He didn't think they made cameras that small. Microphones, maybe. He realized that was why X-Ray didn't want to talk to him about the gold tube at breakfast. X-Ray was afraid the warden might have been listening in. One thing was certain. They weren't just digging to build character. They were definitely digging for something. And whatever they were looking for, they were looking for it in the wrong place. Stanley gazed out across the lake, towards the spot where he had been digging yesterday, where he had found the gold tube. He dug the hole into his memory. As Stanley entered the rec room, he could hear X-Ray's voice from all the way across the room. "See what I'm saying?" X-Ray said. "Am I right or am I right?" The other bodies in the room were little more than bags of flesh and bones, dumped across broken chairs and couches. X-Ray was full of life, laughing and waving his arms around as he talked. "Yo, caveman, my man," he called out. Stanley made his way across the room. "Hey, slide over, Squid," said X-Ray. "Make room for the caveman." Stanley crashed on the couch. He had looking for a hidden camera in the shower. He hadn't seen anything, and he hoped the warden hadn't either. "What's the matter?" asked X-Ray. "You guys tired or something?" He laughed. "Hey, keep it down, will ya? I'm trying to watch TV," groaned Zigzag. Stanley glanced uncertainly at Zigzag, who was staring very intently at the busted television screen. The warden greeted the boys at breakfast and the next morning and went with them to the holes. 4 dug in the holes and 3 tended to the wheelbarrows. "Glad you're here, X-Ray," she said to him. "We'll need your sharp eyes." Stanley spent most time pushing the wheelbarrow than digging, because he was such a slow digger. He carted away the excess dirt and dumped it into previously dug holes. He was careful not to dug any of it in the hole where the gold tube was actually found. He could still see the tube in his mind. It looked so familiar, but he just couldn't place it. He thought that it might be the lid to a fancy gold pen. KB could have been the initials of a famous author. The only famous authors he could think of were Charles Dickens, William Shakespeare, and Mark Twain. Besides, it didn't really look like the top of a pen. By lunchtime, the warden was beginning to lose her patience. She made them eat quickly so that they could get back to work. "If you can't get them to work any faster," she told Mr. Sir, "then you're going to have to climb down there and dig with them." After that, everybody worked faster, especially when Mr. Sir was watching them. Stanley practically ran when he pushed his wheelbarrow. Mr. Sir reminded them that they weren't Girl Scouts. They didn't quit digging until after every other group had finished. Later, as Stanley sat sprawled across an understuffed chair, he tried to think of a way to tell the warden where the tube was really found, without getting himself or X-Ray into trouble. It didn't seem possible, even though he thought about sneaking out at night and digging in the hole by himself. The last thing he wanted to do, after digging all day, was to dig at night too. Besides, the shovels were locked up at night, presumably so that they couldn't be used as weapons. Mr. Podensky entered the rec room. "Stanley," he called as he made his way over to him. His name's Caveman," said X-Ray. "Stanley," said Mr. Podensky. My name's Caveman," said Stanley. "Well, I have a letter here for someone named Stanley Yellnuts," said Mr. Podensky. He turned over an envelope in his hands. "It doesn't say Caveman anywhere." Thanks," Stanley said, taking it. It was from his mother. "Who's it from?" Squid asked. "Your mother?" Stanley put it in the big pocket of his pants. "Aren't you gonna read it to us?" asked Armpit. "Give him some space," said X-Ray. "If Caveman doesn't want to read it to us, he doesn't have to. It's probably from his girlfriend." Stanley smiled. He read it later, after the other boys had gone to dinner. "Dear Stanley, it was wonderful to hear about you. Your letter made me feel like one of the moms who can afford to send their kids to summer camp. I know it's not the same, but I'm very proud of you trying to make the best of a bad situation. Who knows, maybe something good will come of this. Your father thinks he is real close to a breakthrough on his sneaker project. I hope so. The landlord is threatening to evict us because of the odor. I feel sorry for the little old lady who lived in the shoe. It must have smelled awful. Love from both of us. What's so funny? Zero asked. It startled him. He thought Zero had gone to dinner with others. Nothing, just something my mom wrote. What'd she say? Zero asked. Nothing. Oh, sorry, said Zero. Well, see, my dad is trying to invent a way to recycle old sneakers, so the apartment kind of smells bad because he's always cooking those old sneakers. So anyway, in the letter, my mom said she felt sorry for the little old lady who lived in the shoe because, it must have smelled really bad in there. Zero stared blankly at him. You know the nursery rhyme? Zero said nothing. You've heard of the nursery rhyme about the little old lady who lived in a shoe? No. Stanley was amazed. How does it go? Said Zero. Didn't you ever watch Sesame Street? Stanley asked. Zero stared blankly again. Stanley headed out to dinner. He would have felt pretty silly reciting nursery rhymes at Camp Green Lake. For the next week and a half, the boys continued to dig in and around the area where X-Ray had supposedly found the gold tube. They widened X-Ray's hole, as well as the holes Armpit and Squid had been digging, until the fourth day, when all three holes met and formed one big hole. As the days wore on, the warden became less and less patient. She arrived later in the morning and left earlier in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the boys continued to dig later and later. This is no bigger than it was when I left you yesterday, she said after arriving late one morning, well after sunrise. What have you been doing down there? Nothing, said Squid. It was the wrong thing to say. At just that moment, Armpit was returning from a bathroom break. How nice of you to join us, she said. And what have you been doing? I had to, go. The warden jabbed at Armpit with her pitchfork, knocking him backwards into the big hole. The pitchfork left 3 holes in his front shirt and 3 tiny spots of blood. You're giving these boys too much water, the warden told Mr. Belinsky. They continued to dig until late afternoon, long after all the other groups had finished for the day. Stanley was down in the big hole, along with 6 other boys. They had stopped using the wheelbarrows. He dug his shovel into the side of the hole. He scooped up some dirt and was raising it up to the surface when Zigzag's shovel caught him in the side of the head. He collapsed. He wasn't sure if he passed out or not. He looked up to see Zigzag's wild head staring down at him. I ain't digging that dirt up, Zigzag said. That's your dirt. Hey, Mom, Magnet called. Caveman's been hurt. Stanley brought his fingers up to the side of his neck. He felt some wet blood and pretty big gash just below his ear. Magnet helped Stanley to his feet, then up and out of the hole. Mr. Sir made a bandage out of a piece of his sack of sunflower seeds and taped it over Stanley's wound. Then he told him to get back to work. It isn't nap time. When Stanley returned to his hole, Zigzag was been waiting for him. That's your dirt, Zigzag said. You have to dig it up. It's covering up my dirt. Stanley felt a little dizzy. He could see a small pile of dirt. It took him a moment to realize that it was the dirt which had been on his shovel when he was hit. He scooped it up, and Zigzag dug his shovel into the ground underneath where Stanley's dirt had been. The next morning, Mr. Sir marched the boys to another section of the lake, and each boy dug his own hole, 5 feet deep and 5 feet wide. Stanley was glad to be away from the big hole. At least now he knew just how much he had to dig for the day, and it was a relief not to have other shovels swinging past his face, or the warden hanging over. He dug his shovel into the dirt, then slowly turned to dump it into a pile. He had to make his turn smooth and slow. If he jerked too quickly, he felt a throbbing pain just above his neck where Zigzag's shovel had hit him. That part of his head, between his neck and his ear, was considerably swollen. There were no mirrors in class, but he imagined he looked like a hard-boiled egg sticking out of him. The remainder of his body hardly hurt at all. His muscles had strengthened, and his hands were tough and calloused. He was still the slowest digger, but not all that much slower than Magnet. Less than 30 minutes after Magnet returned to camp, Stanley spat into his hole. After his shovel, he put his dirty clothes in his crate and got out his box of stationery. He stayed in the tent to write the letter so Squid and the other boys wouldn't make fun of him for writing to his mother. Dear Mom and Dad, camp is hard, but challenging. We've been running obstacle courses, and we've had to swim long distances on the lake. Tomorrow we will learn. He stopped writing as Zero walked into the tent, then returned to his letter. He didn't care what Zero thought. Zero was nobody. To rock climb. I know that sounds scary, but don't worry. Zero was standing beside him now, watching him write. Stanley turned and felt his neck throb. I don't like it when you read over my shoulder, okay? Zero said nothing. I'll be careful. It's not all fun and games here, but I think I'm getting a lot out of it. It builds character. The other boys, I don't know how, said Zero. What? Can you teach me? Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. Teach you what? To rock climb? Zero stared at him with penetrating eyes. What? Said Stanley. He was hot, tired, and sore. I want to learn to read and write, said Stanley. Stanley let out a short laugh. He wasn't laughing at Zero. He was just surprised. All this time he thought Zero was reading over his shoulder. Sorry, he said. I don't know how to teach. After digging all day, he didn't have the strength to try to teach Zero to read and write. He needed to save his energy for the people who counted. You don't have to teach me to write, said Zero. Just to read. I don't have anybody to write to. Sorry, Stanley said again. His muscles and hands were the only part of his body that had toughened over the past several weeks. His heart had hardened as well. He finished his letter. He barely had moisture in his mouth to seal and stamp the envelope. It seemed no matter how much water he drank, he was always thirsty. He was awakened one night by a strange noise. At first he thought it was some sort of animal, and it frightened him. But as the sleep cleared from his head, he realized that the noise was coming from the cot next to him. Squid was crying. You okay? Stanley whispered. Squid's head jerked around. He sniffed and caught his breath. Yeah, I'm fine, he whispered and sniffed again. In the morning, Stanley asked Squid if he was feeling better. What are you, my mother? Asked Squid. Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. I got allergies, okay? Squid said. Okay, said Stanley. You open your mouth again and I'll break your jaw. Stanley kept his mouth shut most of the time. He didn't talk to much of any of the boys, afraid that he might say something wrong. They called him caveman and all that, but he couldn't forget that they were dangerous too. They were all here for a reason. As Mr. Sir would say, this wasn't a Girl Scout camp. Stanley was thankful there were no racial problems. X-Ray, Armpit, and Zero were black. He, Squid, and Zigzag were white. Magnet was Hispanic. On the lake, they were all the same reddish-brown color, the color of dirt. He looked up from his hole to see the water truck and its trailing dust cloud. His canteen was still almost a quarter full. He quickly drank it down, then took his place in line, behind Magnet in front of Zero. The air was thick with heat, dust, and exhaust fumes. Mr. Sir filed their canteens. The truck pulled away. Stanley was back in his hole, shovel in hand, when he heard Magnet call out, "Anybody want some sunflower seeds?" Magnet was standing at ground level, holding a sack of seeds. He popped a handful into his mouth, chewing and swallowed, shell and all. "Over here," called X-Ray. The sack looked to be about half full. Magnet rolled up the top and tossed it to X-Ray. "How did you get them without Mr. Sir seeing ya?" asked Armpit. "I can't help it," Magnet said. He held both his hands up and wriggled his fingers and laughed. "My fingers are like little magnets." The sack went from X-Ray to Armpit to Squid. "I'm sure good to eat something that doesn't come from a can," said Armpit. Squid tossed the sack to Zigzag. Stanley knew it would come to him next. He didn't even want it. From the moment Magnet shouted, "Anybody want some sunflower seeds?" he knew there would be trouble. Mr. Sir was sure to come back, and anyway the salted shells would only make him thirstier. "Coming your way, caveman," said Zigzag. "Airmail and special delivery." It's unclear whether the seeds spilled before they got to Stanley or after he dropped the bag. It seemed to him that Zigzag hadn't rolled up the top before throwing it, and was the reason he didn't catch it. But it all happened very fast. One moment the sack was flying through the air, and the next thing Stanley knew, the sack was in his hole, and the seeds were spilled across the dirt. "Oh, man," said Magnet. "Sorry," Stanley said as he tried to sweep the seeds back into the sack. "I don't want to eat dirt," said X-Ray. Stanley didn't know what to do. "The track's coming!" shouted Zigzag. Stanley looked up at the approaching dust cloud, then looked back at the spilled seeds. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. What else was new? He dug his shovel into the hole and tried to turn over the dirt and bury the seeds. What he should have done, he realized later, was knock one of his big dirt piles back into his hole. But the idea of putting dirt back into his hole was unthinkable. "Hello, Mr. Sir," said X-Ray. "Back so soon?" "It seems like you were just here," said Armpit. "Time flies when you're having fun," said Magnet. Stanley continued to turn the dirt over in his hole. "You Girl Scouts having a good time?" asked Mr. Sir. He moved from one hole to another. He kicked a dirt pile by Magnet's hole, then he moved to Stanley. Stanley could see 2 seeds at the bottom of his hole. As he tried to cover them up, he unearthed a corner of the sack. "Well, what do you know, caveman?" said Mr. Sir, standing over him. "It looks like you found something." Stanley didn't know what to do. "Dig it out," Mr. Sir said. "We'll take it to the warden. Maybe she'll give you the rest of the day off." It's not anything," Stanley muttered. "Let me be the judge of that," said Mr. Sir. Stanley reached down and pulled up the empty burlap sack. He tried to hand it to Mr. Sir, but he wouldn't take it. "So tell me, caveman," said Mr. Sir, "how did my sack of sunflower seeds get in your hole?" "I stole it from the truck." "You did?" "Yes, Mr. Sir." "What happened to all the sunflower seeds?" "I ate them." "By yourself?" Yes, Mr. Sir. Hey, caveman, shouted Armpit. How come you didn't share any of that with us? That's cold, man, said X-Ray. I thought you were our friend, said Magnet. Mr. Sir looked around from one boy to another, then back to Stanley. We'll see how the warden has to say about that. Let's go. Stanley climbed up out of his hole and followed Mr. Sir to the truck. He still held the empty sack. It felt good to sit inside the truck out of the direct rays of the sun. Stanley was surprised he could feel good about anything at the moment, but he did. It felt good to sit down on his comfortable seat for a change, and as the truck bounced away along the dirt, he was able to appreciate the air blowing through the open window under his hot and sweaty face. It felt good to walk in the shade of the 2 oak trees. Stanley wondered if this was a condescending man felt on his way to the electric chair, appreciating all the good things in life for the last time. They had to step around holes to get to the cabin door. And then Stanley was surprised to see so many around the cabin. He would have expected the warden not to want the campers digging so close to our home, but several holes were right up against the cabin wall. The holes were closer together here as well, and they were of different shapes and sizes. Mr. Sir knocked on the door. Stanley still held the empty stack. Yes, the warden said, opening the door. There's been a little trouble out on the lake, Mr. Sir said. Caveman will tell you all about it. The warden stared at Mr. Sir a moment. Then her gaze turned towards Stanley. He felt nothing but dread now. Come in, I suppose, said the warden. You're letting the cold air out. It was air-conditioned inside her cabin. The television was going. She picked up the remote and turned it off. She sat back on her canvas chair. She wore barefoot and was wearing shorts. Her legs were so freckled as her face and arms. So, what is it you have to tell me? Stanley took a breath to steady himself. While Mr. Sir was filling the canteens, I snuck into the truck and stole a sack of sunflower seeds. I see. She turned to Mr. Sir. That's why you brought him here? Yeah, but I think he's lying. I think someone else stole the sack and Caveman is covering up for X-Ray or someone. It was a 20-pound sack and he claims to have eaten them all by himself. He took the sack from Stanley and handed it to the warden. I see, the warden said again. The sack wasn't full, said Stanley, and I spilled a lot. You can check my hole. In that room, Caveman, there's a small flowered case. Will you get it for me? She pointed to the door. Stanley looked at the door, then at the warden, then back at the door. He slowly walked towards it. It was kind of a dressing room with a sink and a mirror. Next to the sink, he saw this case, white with pink roses. He brought it back out to the warden, and she set it on the glass coffee table in front of her. She unclasped the latch and opened the case. It was a makeup case. Stanley's mother had one similar to it. He saw several bottles of nail polish, polish remover, and a couple of lipstick tools with other jars and powders. The warden held up the small jar of dark red nail polish. You see this, Caveman? He nodded. This is my special nail polish. Do you see the dark, rich color? You can't buy that in a store. I have to make it myself. Stanley had no idea why she was showing it to him. He wondered why the warden would ever need to wear nail polish or makeup. Do you want to know my secret ingredient? He raised and lowered one shoulder. The warden opened the bottle. Rattlesnake venom. With a small paintbrush, She began applying it to her nails on the left hand. It's perfectly harmless when it's dry. She finished her left hand. She waved it in the air for a few seconds and then began painting the nails on her right hand. It's only toxic while it's wet. She finished painting her nails, then stood up. She reached over and touched Stanley's face with her finger. She ran her sharp, wet nails very gently across his cheek. He felt his skin tingle. The nail on her pinky just barely touched the wound behind his ear. A sharp sting of pain caused him to jump back. The warden turned to face Mr. Sir, who was sitting on the fireplace hearth. So, you think he stole your sunflower seeds? No, he said he stole them, but I think it was... She stepped towards him and struck him across the face. Mr. Sir stared at her. He had 3 long red marks slanted against the left side of his face. Stanley didn't know if the redness was caused by her nail polish or his blood. It took a moment for the venom to sink in. Suddenly, Mr. Sir was screaming and clutched his face with both hands. He let himself fall over, rolling over the hearth and onto the rug. The warden spoke softly. I don't especially care about your sunflower seeds. Mr. Sir moaned. If you must know, said the warden, I liked it better when you smoked. For a second, Mr. Sir's pain seemed to recede. He took several long, deep breaths. Then his head jerked violently, and he let out a shrill scream, worse than the one before. The warden turned to Stanley. I suggest you go back to your hole now. Stanley started to go, but Mr. Sir lay in the way. Stanley could see the muscles on his face jump and twitch. His body wriggled in agony. Stanley stepped carefully over him. Is he... Excuse me? Said the warden. Stanley was too frightened to speak. He's not going to die, the warden said. Unfortunately for you. It was a long walk back to his hole. Stanley looked around through the haze of heat and dirt as the other boys lowered and raised their shovels. Group D was the farthest away. He realized that once again he would be digging long after everyone else had quit. He hoped he finished before Mr. Sir recovered. He didn't want to be out there alone with Mr. Sir. He won't die, the warden had said. Unfortunately for you. Walking across the desolate wasteland, Stanley thought about his great-grandfather. Not the pig stealer, but the pig stealer's son, the one who was robbed by Kissing Kate Barlow. He tried to imagine how he must have felt after Kissing Kate Barlow had left him stranded in the desert. It probably wasn't a whole lot different from what he felt himself now. Kate Barlow had left his great-grandfather to face the hot, barren desert. The warden had left Stanley to face Mr. Sir. Somehow his great-grandfather had survived for 17 days before he was rescued by a couple of rattlesnake hunters. He was insane when they found him. When they asked how he had lived so long, he said he found refuge on God's thumb. He spent nearly a month in the hospital. He ended up marrying one of the nurses. No one ever knew what he meant by God's thumb, including himself. Stanley heard a twitching sound. He stopped midair, with one foot still in the air. A rattlesnake lay coiled beneath his feet. Its tail was pointed upwards, rattling. Stanley backed his leg away, then turned away and ran. The rattlesnake didn't chase after him. It had rattled its tail to warn him to stay away. "Thanks for the warning," Miss Stanley said, whispering as his heart pounded. The rattlesnake would be a lot more dangerous if it didn't have its rattle. "Hey, caveman," called Armpit. "You're still alive?" "What'd the warden say?" said X-Ray. "What did you tell her?" asked Magnet. "I told her I stole the seeds," said Stanley. "Good going," said Magnet. "What'd she do?" asked Zigzag. Stanley shrugged one shoulder. "Nothing. She got mad at Mr. Sir for bothering her." He didn't feel like going on about details. If he didn't talk about it, then maybe it didn't happen. He went over to his hole, and to his surprise, it was nearly finished. He stared at it, amazed. It didn't make sense, but perhaps it did. He smiled. Since he was the one who had taken the blame for the sunflower seeds, he realized the other boys had dug his hole for him. "Hey, thanks," he said. "Don't look at me," said X-Ray. Confused, Stanley looked around, from Magnet to Armpit to Zigzag to Squid. None of them took credit for it. Then he turned to Zero, who had been quietly digging in his hole since Stanley's return. Zero's hole was smaller than all the others. Stanley was the first one finished. He spat in his hole, then showered and changed into a cleaner set of clothes. It had been 3 days since the laundry had done, so even his clean set was dirty and smelly. Tomorrow, these would become his work clothes, and the other set would be washed. He could think of no reason why Zero would dig his hole for him. Zero didn't even get any sunflower seeds. "I guess he likes to dig holes," Armpit had said. "He's a mole," Zigzag had said. "I think he eats dirt." "Moles don't eat dirt," X-Ray had pointed out. "Worms eat dirt." "Hey, Zero," Squid had asked, "are you a mole or a worm?" Zero had said nothing. Stanley hadn't even thanked him, but now he sat on his cot and waited for Zero to return from his shower room. "Thanks," he said as Zero entered through the tent flap. Zero glanced at him and then went over to the crate and deposited his dirty clothes and towel. "Why'd you help me?" Stanley asked. Zero turned around. "You didn't steal the sunflower seeds," he said. "So, neither did you," said Stanley. Zero stared at him. His eyes seemed to expand. It was almost as if Zero was looking right through him. "You didn't steal the stickers," he said. Stanley said nothing. He watched Zero walk out of the tent. If anybody had X-ray vision, it was Zero. "Wait!" he called, then hurried out after him. Zero had stopped just outside the tent, and Stanley almost ran right into him. "I'll try to teach you to read if you want," Stanley offered. "I don't know if I know how to teach, but I'm not that worn out today since you dug a hole out of my hole." A big smile spread across Zero's face. They returned to the tent, where they were least likely to get bothered. Stanley got his box of stationery and a pen out of his crate. They sat on the ground. "Do you know the alphabet?" Stanley said. For a second, he thought he saw a flash of defiance in Zero's eyes, but then it passed. "I think I know some of it," Zero said. "A, B, C, D." "Keep going," said Stanley. Zero's eyes looked upward. "E, F," said Stanley. "G," said Zero. He blew some air out of the side of his mouth. "H, I, K, P?" "H-I-J-K-L," Stanley said. "That's right," said Zero. "I've heard it before. I just don't really have it memorized exactly." That's all right, said Stanley. Here, I'll say the whole thing just to kind of refresh your memory. Then you can try. He recited the alphabet for Zero. Then Zero repeated it without a single mistake. Not bad for a kid who had never seen Sesame Street. Well, I've heard it before, somewhere, Zero said, trying to act like it was nothing. But his big smile gave him away. The next step was harder. Stanley had figured out how to teach him to recognize each letter. He gave Zero a piece of paper and took a piece for himself. I guess we'll start with A. He printed a capital A and then Zero copied on his sheet of paper. The paper wasn't lined, which made it more difficult. But Zero's A wasn't bad, just a little big. Stanley told him he needed to write smaller, or else he'll run out of paper real quick. Zero printed it smaller. Actually, there are 2 ways to write each letter, Stanley said, as he realized this was going to be harder than he thought. That's a capital A, but usually you'll see a small a. You only have capitals at the beginning of a word, and only if it's at the start of a sentence, or if it's a proper noun, like a name. Zero nodded as if he understood, but Stanley knew he didn't really get it. So he printed a lowercase a, and Zero copied. So there are 52? Said Zero. Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. Instead of 26 letters, there are really 52? Stanley looked at him, surprised. I guess that's right. How did you figure that out? He asked. Zero said nothing. Did you add? Zero said nothing. Did you multiply? That's just how many there are, said Zero. Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. He didn't even know that Zero knew there were 26 in the first place. Did he count them as he recited them? He had Zero write a few more upper and lower cases A, and then he moved on to a capital B. He realized this was going to take a long time. He realized, you could teach me 10 letters a day, suggested Zero. 5 capitals and 5 smalls. After 5 days, I'll know them all, except on the last day where I'll have to do 12. 6 capitals and 6 smalls. Again, Stanley stared at him, amazed that he was able to figure that all out. Zero must have thought he was staring for a different reason, because he said, I'll dig part of your hole every day. I can dig for about an hour and then you can teach me for an hour? And since I'm a faster digger anyway, our holes will get done about the same time. I won't have to wait for you. Okay, Stanley agreed. As Zero was printing his B's, Stanley asked how he figured out it would take 5 days. Did you multiply? Did you divide? That's just what it is, Zero said. It's good math, said Stanley. I know I'm not stupid, Zero said. I know everybody thinks I am. I just don't like answering their questions. Later that night, as he lay on his cot, Stanley reconsidered the deal he had made with Zero. Getting a break every day would be a relief, but he knew X-Ray wouldn't like it. He wondered if there would be some way Zero could agree to dig part of X-Ray's hole as well. But then again, why should he? I'm the one teaching Zero. I need the break so I'll have energy to teach him. I'm the one who took the blame for the sunflower seeds. I'm the one who Mr. Sir is mad at. He closed his eyes, and images from the warden's cabin floated inside his head. Her red fingernails, Mr. Sir writhing on the floor, her flowered makeup kit. He opened his eyes. He had realized where he had seen the gold tube before. He had seen it in his mother's bathroom, and he'd seen it again on the warden's cabin. It was half of a lipstick container. KB! He felt a jolt of astonishment. His mouth silently formed the name, Kate Barlow, and he wondered if he really could have belonged to the kissing outlaw. 110 years ago, Green Lake was the largest lake in Texas. It was full of cool, clear water, and it sparkled like a giant emerald in the sun. It was especially beautiful in the spring, where the peach trees which lined the shore bloomed with pink and red rose-colored blossoms. There was also a town picnic on the 4th of July. They'd play games, dance, sing, and swim in the lake to keep cool. Prizes were awarded to the best peach pie and peach jam. A special prize was given every year to Miss Catherine Barlow for her famous spiced peaches. No one even tried to make spiced peaches because they knew they could never be as delicious as hers. Every summer, Miss Catherine would pick bushels of peaches and preserve them in jars with cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and other spices, which she kept secret. The jars of peaches would last all winter. They probably would have lasted a lot longer than that, but they were always eaten by the end of the winter. It was said that Green Lake was heaven on earth, and the Miss Catherine's spiced peaches were food for the angels. Catherine Barlow was the town's only school teacher. She taught in a one-room schoolhouse. It was old even then. The roof leaked, the windows wouldn't open, the door hung crooked on its bent hinges. She was a wonderful teacher, full of knowledge and full of life. The children loved her. She taught classes in the evenings for adults, and many of the adults loved her as well. She was very pretty, and her classes were often full of young men, who were a lot more interested in the teacher than they were in getting an education. But all they ever got was an education. One such young man was Trout Walker. His real name was Charles Walker, but everyone called him Trout because his 2 feet smelled like a couple of dead fishes. This wasn't entirely Trout's fault. He had an incurable foot fungus. In fact, it was the same foot fungus that 110 years later would afflict the famous ball player Clyde Livingston. But at least Clyde Livingston showered every day. "I take a bath every Sunday morning," Trout would brag, "whether I need to or not." Most everyone in the town of Green Lake expected Miss Catherine to marry Trout Walker. He was the son of the richest man in the country. His family owned most of the peach trees and all the land on the east side of the lake. Trout often showed up at night school, but never paid attention. He talked in class and was disrespectful of the students around him. He was loud and stupid. A lot of men in town were not educated. That didn't bother Miss Catherine. She knew they'd spent most of their lives working on farms and ranches, and they hadn't had much schooling. That was why she was there, to teach them. But Trout didn't want to learn. He seemed to be proud of his stupidity. "How'd you like to take a ride on my new boat this Saturday?" he asked her one evening after class. "No, thank you," said Miss Catherine. "We've got a brand new boat," he said. "You don't even have to row it." "Yes, I know," said Miss Catherine. Everyone in town had seen and heard the Walkers' new boat. It made a horrible, loud noise and spewed ugly black smoke over the beautiful lake. Trout had always gotten everything he wanted. He found it hard to believe that Miss Catherine had turned him down. He pointed his finger at him and said, "No one ever says no to Charles Walker." "I believe I just did," said Catherine Barlow.